The year is 105 BC. Rome, mistress of the Mediterranean, appears invincible. 2 centuries of conquest have transformed the Republic from a city-state into the dominant power of the known world. Carthage is no more. In 146 BC, its ruins smoldered under Roman fire, salted to ensure nothing grew again. The memory of Hannibal, once Rome's greatest nightmare, is now just that, a memory. Greece has fallen. The intellectual heart of the Mediterranean is subdued, its treasures carried back to Rome, its philosophers serving Roman patrons. The Iberian Peninsula is pacified, at least in name. Numantia, the stubborn Celtiberian fortress, was razed after years of defiance. From the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the mountains of Asia Minor, the eagle of Rome flies. Rome seems eternal, the chosen city of Mars. Outsiders look at her with awe and dread, but the gods are rarely kind to hubris. Beneath the marble and triumphal processions, the Republic is rotting. The optimates, conservative aristocrats, cling to tradition, using the Senate as their fortress. The populares, tribunes of the people, promise reforms to win the support of the urban poor. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, had already been murdered for daring to challenge senatorial privilege. Their blood stains the Forum, still a reminder that politics in Rome is war by other means. Meanwhile, the countryside empties. Smallholders, the citizen farmers who once filled Rome's legions, return from years abroad to find their farms seized by creditors or swallowed by great estates, the latifundia. These estates, worked by slaves, captured from every conquest, enrich the elite while impoverishing the backbone of the Republic. Rome's legions, once citizen militias fighting for home and hearth, are increasingly made up of desperate men clinging to survival. Their loyalty shifts. No longer bound to the Senate or the people, they begin to follow the only figure who offers them stability, their commander. And this shift, subtle but seismic, will change Rome forever. Unlike Carthage or Macedon, Rome's next enemy does not come from a polished civilization with cities, temples, and philosophers. It comes instead from the cold, windswept lands of the far north, from tribes Rome scarcely knew existed, the Cimbri and the Teutones. Their origins remain mysterious. Ancient writers struggled to classify them. Some called them Celts, others Germans. Modern scholars suggest they may have been a blend Germanic by language, but influenced by Celtic neighbours. Even their leaders' names reveal this ambiguity. Boiorix, king of the Cimbri, bore a Celtic name, yet his people were later counted among the Germans. What is certain is this. Sometime in the late 2nd century BC, the Cimbri and Teutones abandoned their homeland in Jutland, modern Denmark. Ancient writers speculated on the reasons. Floods and storms washed away their fields. Crop failure and famine pushed them to seek better lands. Or perhaps pressure from other northern tribes drove them southward. Whatever the cause, their migration was unprecedented. They were not an army, but an entire nation on the move. Men, women, children, wagons, herds of cattle, dogs pulling sledges. Imagine not tens of thousands of warriors, but hundreds of thousands of souls, a tide of humanity pouring southward. They first met Rome in 113 BC at Norea in Noricum, modern Austria. There, they annihilated a Roman force under Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. Rome, stunned, could not comprehend how barbarians unknown to history had destroyed a legion. Worse still, the tribes did not vanish after victory. They kept moving, slipping past Roman defences, weaving through Gaul like a storm cloud. For a decade, the Cimbri and Teutones roamed Gaul, their banners casting a shadow across Roman provinces. Roman armies sent against them were humiliated. Each failure stirred an old fear buried deep in the Roman psyche, the memory of 390 BC, when the Gauls under Brennus had stormed into Rome itself, leaving the city in ashes. That trauma, never forgotten, made every northern incursion a nightmare reborn. If the Cimbri and Teutones were the storm rolling down from the north, then the Republic sent 2 men to stop them, 2 men whose pride would tear Rome apart. Maximus was a novus homo, a new man.
Let us unite.
In the rigid hierarchy of Roman politics, this term meant everything. He was the first in his family to rise to the consulship, the highest annual office in the Republic. His ancestors had no statues in the Forum, No long list of triumphs, no ancient lineage reaching back to the kings of Rome. To the optimates, the aristocratic elite, he was an upstart. But to the common people, Maximus represented possibility. Here was proof that merit, not birth, could bring a man to the pinnacle of power. His consulship was a political earthquake, and many senators gritted their teeth when they were forced to salute him as consul. Yet Maximus was not Hannibal, nor Scipio. He was competent but inexperienced. His position was precarious. He commanded Rome's largest army not because the Senate loved him, but because political necessity demanded it. The Republic was desperate. Facing Maximus across the chain of command was Quintus Servilius Caepio, the proconsul. Caepio was the very image of Roman aristocracy, proud, wealthy, steeped in a lineage that reached back generations. His family, the Servili, had produced consuls, censors, and generals for centuries. He embodied the optimate's belief that only the nobly born could defend Rome's traditions. But Caepio was arrogant, obstinate, and bitter. To him, Maximus was not a colleague, he was an insult. The Senate, in his eyes, had entrusted Rome's safety to a nobody, a plebeian who dared to sit in the consul's chair. And so, from the very beginning, Caepio refused to cooperate. He rejected Maximus's authority, dismissed his orders, and treated him not as an equal but as an intruder into the sacred domain of patricians. Together, they commanded nearly 100,000 men, legionaries, allied contingents, cavalry, engineers, and tens of thousands of servants, smiths, and camp followers. On paper, this was one of the largest forces Rome had ever assembled in Gaul. United, they might have crushed the Cimbri and Teutones, but unity was impossible. Caepio refused to share supplies with Maximus. The armies camped separately along the Rhone, their camps glaring at one another across the river. Orders were ignored, messages twisted into insults. Soldiers began whispering. Their generals hated each other more than they hated the enemy. Rome had faced Carthage, Macedon, and countless tribes before. Never had her armies entered battle so divided against themselves. Across the river, the Cimbri watched. Their king, Boiorix, was no fool. He knew the Romans were strong, but he also saw the cracks in their armor. 2 camps, 2 commanders, no unity. For a seasoned war leader who had marched across Europe, the opportunity was too tempting. The Cimbri and their Teutonic allies stretched in a great encampment, wagons circling like walls, banners fluttering in the autumn wind. The Romans looked upon them as barbarians, yet these barbarians had fought from the Baltic to the Pyrenees. They had learned to adapt, to strike at weakness, to exploit arrogance. Among Maximus's staff was the experienced legate Marcus Aurelius Scaurus. In a clash of skirmishes, Scaurus was captured and brought before Boiorix himself. The story, preserved by Orosius, is striking. Even as a prisoner, Scaurus did not plead for his life. Instead, he warned Boiorix that Rome was eternal, that even if one army was destroyed, others would come, and the Cimbri would be hunted to extinction. Boiorix, impressed yet enraged, offered Scaurus a chance to join him. When Scaurus refused, calling it dishonorable, Boiorix ordered him executed. It was a small moment, but symbolic. The Romans would meet their end at Arausio not with pleas, but with defiance. The 6th of October, 105 BC. The dawn broke cold and grey. The waters of the Rhone moved sluggishly under the rising sun. On the southern bank, Maximus's army lay camped, cautiously positioned near the road to Massilia, modern Marseille, ensuring lines of retreat and supply. His men, though nervous, had a defensible position. On the northern bank, Caepio's forces were restless. The proconsul had no intention of waiting for Maximus's cautious strategy. He believed the Cimbri were disorganized, that a swift strike could bring him personal glory. In the Senate, it would not be said that Maximus had saved Rome, it would be Caepio. That morning, without coordination, without informing his consul, Caepio ordered his legions to cross the river. His men splashed into the Rhone, shields raised, pilums clutched, banners high. It was an act not of strategy, but of pride. The 6th of October, 105 BC. The Rhone shimmered under the pale light of dawn. To the south, Maximus's camp was still quiet, his soldiers preparing rations. repairing armor, tightening shield straps. To the north, however, the standards of Quintus Servilius Caepio were already moving. Against all advice, against the pleas of his officers, Caepio had resolved to act. He would not wait for Maximus, the new man. The glory of defeating the Cimbri would belong to him, to the Servili family, not to some plebeian pretender. So Caepio gave the order. Legionaries began to cross the Rhone, their armor glinting in the rising sun. Standard-bearers raised their eagle aloft. Drums and horns echoed across the valley. It was a spectacle meant to awe the barbarians. Instead, it exposed Rome's weakness. The Cimbri had watched the Romans for weeks. They saw two armies camped apart, two commanders refusing to speak. Now, as Caepio's men advanced alone, the trap was sprung. From the wagon laager, a roar rose, a thunderous chorus of voices, men and women together. The ground shook as thousands of warriors surged forward, painted red, clad in furs, their spears bristling like a forest. They fell upon Caepio's army. At first, the Romans held. Legionaries locked shields, thrust pylons into the oncoming tide. The air was filled with the sound of iron striking wood, the clash of steel on bone. For a brief moment, discipline seemed to hold back chaos, but the Cimbri were relentless. Their warriors crashed against the Roman line again and again, like waves against a wall. Some hurled massive axes, others jabbed long spears over shield rims, and when one Roman fell, the gap widened, and into it poured 10 more Cimbri. Caepio had not prepared reserves. He had no coordinated strategy. His arrogance had left his men exposed, and soon the legion began to buckle. Once discipline cracked, panic spread like wildfire. Legionaries turned, stumbling back toward the river. Officers shouted, centurions raised vine staffs, but fear drowned out their commands. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers hurled themselves into the Rhone, trying to swim back to safety. The river, swollen with autumn rains, became a grave. Men sank under the weight of their armor, dragging comrades down with them. Shields and helmets floated downstream like debris. Caepio himself fled, abandoning his men. His army was annihilated. From the southern bank, Maximus's soldiers watched in horror. Across the water, they saw their fellow Romans torn apart, drowned, trampled beneath barbarian fury. The screams carried across the Rhone, a chorus of death that froze even the most hardened veteran. The slaughter of Caepio's army might have been enough, but the Cimbri were not finished. With terrifying swiftness, they regrouped, crossed the fords of the Rhone, and hurled themselves directly at Maximus's camp. Maximus had chosen his position carefully. His camp was fortified, his supplies secure, his legions numerous. But morale had been shattered. The men had just watched tens of thousands of Romans die. They knew the enemy was coming, and they no longer believed they could win. The attack came like a flood. Thousands of Cimbri and Teutones surged into the Roman camp, overwhelming sentries and bursting through gates. Legionaries tried to form maniples, but confusion reigned. Orders contradicted orders. The cavalry, hemmed in by wagons and tents, had no room to maneuver. The auxiliaries, poorly coordinated, broke under the first charge. The legionaries, though disciplined, were outnumbered, disoriented, and demoralized. The battle quickly became slaughter. Some Romans fought to the last, forming tight knots of resistance, shields locked, gladii flashing. But the Cimbri pressed in with sheer weight of numbers. Spears pierced Roman mail. Axes shattered helmets. The air grew thick with dust and blood. Supply wagons caught fire. Mules and horses screamed as they were cut down. Slaves, smiths, and women who had followed the army were butchered without mercy. The Rhone ran red. Ancient writers struggled to capture the scale. Arausius, writing centuries later, claimed 112,000 Romans perished. Others said 80,000 legionaries and 40,000 camp followers died in a single day. Modern scholars debate the exact figure, but all agree Arausio was one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. To compare, at Cannae, 216 BC, perhaps 50,000 Romans died at the hands of Hannibal. At Arausio, nearly twice that number fell. Never before, and rarely again, Would Rome suffer such a loss in one day? A handful escaped. Some swam the Rhone. Some fled south toward Massilia. They carried with them not just news of defeat, but the memory of horror. Comrades drowning in armor, entire maniples erased, the screams of women and children in the enemy's laager, and the terrifying sight of barbarians who seemed unbreakable. When they reached Rome, they brought panic. For the first time since Hannibal, the Republic trembled for its very survival. And yet, what makes Arausio even more haunting is what happened next. The Cimbri and Teutones, though victorious, did not march on Rome. They could have. Italy lay open. The legions in Gaul were gone, but instead, the tribes turned west, drifting into Spain, seeking land, not conquest. To the Romans, this was almost more terrifying. Their enemy was not an empire seeking to conquer, nor a general seeking revenge. It was a force of nature, unpredictable, uncontrollable, sweeping across the map without reason or diplomacy. Rome had been spared, but only by chance. In the end, Arausio was not lost because Rome lacked men, weapons, or courage. It was lost because of division, arrogance, and pride. Caepio sought glory, not survival. Maximus hesitated, paralyzed by politics. The Senate had allowed personal rivalry to dictate strategy. Rome, at the peak of its power, had destroyed itself. The Republic, shaken to its core, now faced a question it had never asked before. Could Rome survive Rome? The survivors staggered south. Some reached Massilia, modern Marseille, their faces blackened with smoke, their bodies scarred, their eyes hollow with terror. They carried no banners, no eagles, only the memory of horror. When word reached Rome, it struck like a thunderclap. Never before had the Republic suffered such a catastrophe. Not at Cannae, not at Trebia, not at Lake Trasimene. Arausio eclipsed them all. The Forum, usually filled with merchants and orators, became a place of mourning. Mothers rushed to the temples, begging the gods for news of sons who would never return. Families crowded the steps of the Senate, demanding answers. The air was heavy with incense, prayers, and wails. In the annals of Rome, only one memory compared: the sack of the city by the Gauls in 390 BC. That humiliation had never been forgotten. Now, it felt as if the ghosts of Brennus's warriors had returned. The Senate convened in panic. The benches where Caepio's allies once sat were silent. Caepio himself, disgraced and alive, fled back to Rome. He was met not with sympathy, but with fury. He had abandoned his army. He had refused to cooperate with Maximus. He had squandered one of the largest forces ever assembled in Gaul. In time, he would be prosecuted. His estates were confiscated. Legend claims he had once seized a vast treasure from the temple at Tolosa and hidden it away. Some said this was divine punishment, that the gods themselves had cursed him for his greed. The tale of the gold of Tolosa became a whisper on Roman lips, a reminder that arrogance carried a price even beyond mortal battles. Maximus fared little better. Though he had not attacked recklessly, his caution had achieved nothing. His army had been annihilated just as surely as Caepio's. He too was disgraced, his consulship remembered not for leadership, but for ruin. The Senate faced a void. Its proud patricians had failed. Its system had failed. Rome needed salvation, and salvation would not come from tradition. Rome itself descended into fear. With 2 entire armies gone, who was left to defend Italy? Rumors spread that the Cimbri were marching south, that they would soon appear at the gates, as the Gauls had once done. Panic buying erupted. Citizens hoarded grain and oil. Families prepared to flee. The plebeians cursed the Senate. Why should their sons die? Because aristocrats squabbled over honor. Why had the Republic entrusted its survival to men more interested in glory than in Rome itself? The social fabric stretched to the breaking point. At Arausio, Rome had lost not just soldiers, but confidence in its own system. What made Arausio so devastating was not only the number of dead, though that was staggering. It was the sense that Rome had been undone not by superior tactics or technology, but by itself. At Cannae, Hannibal's genius had crushed the legions. At Arausio, Two Roman generals had crushed each other. This realization was almost unbearable. Rome prided itself on discipline, unity, order. Arausio revealed that pride had curdled into arrogance, unity into rivalry, order into chaos. The Republic looked into the mirror and saw weakness staring back. The immediate effect was paralysis. With tens of thousands dead, legions scattered, and Gaul effectively abandoned, the Senate had no choice but to look outside the usual circles of power. Tradition dictated that the great patrician houses, the Cornelii, the Claudii, the Servilii, should provide Rome's saviors. But tradition had just bled to death on the fields of Arausio. The people demanded someone else, someone proven in war, someone untied to the aristocracy's endless feuds. Their eyes turned to a man already known for his victories in Numidia, Gaius Marius. In the months after Arausio, Rome lived in dread. Messengers from Gaul reported that the Cimbri and Teutones were still on the move. No one knew where they would strike next. Would they pour through the Alpine passes? Would they sweep into northern Italy, burning as they came? The Senate ordered frantic levies, but there were not enough men. The conscription system had broken down. Too many citizens were impoverished, their farms long lost, their loyalty fragile. The Republic teetered, the shadow of extinction loomed. And yet, from this darkness, a single figure began to rise. In the wake of Arausio, Rome turned not to an old patrician house, but to a man who, by every measure of tradition, should never have risen so high. Gaius Marius. Marius was born around 157 BC in the small town of Arpinum, southeast of Rome. Arpinum was no backwater. It had produced orators and statesmen, and one day it would produce Cicero. But it was far from the aristocratic heart of the Republic. Marius's family was equestrian, respectable but not noble. He grew up hearing stories of Roman triumphs, dreaming not of senatorial debates, but of the clash of arms. As a youth, he enlisted in the legions and earned a reputation for toughness, endurance, and strict discipline. He served under Scipio Aemilianus at the siege of Numantia in Spain. There, he learned from one of Rome's greatest generals, observing both the brilliance and the pitfalls of command. According to legend, when Scipio was asked who among his soldiers might one day rise to greatness, he tapped Marius on the shoulder. But military valor was not enough. In Rome, politics was the true battlefield, and here, Marius faced his greatest obstacle. He was a novus homo, a new man. The Senate was dominated by families who traced their ancestry back centuries. To them, political office was a birthright. A man like Marius, without noble lineage, was seen as an intruder. Yet Marius possessed qualities the Senate could not ignore. Ruthless ambition. He never hid his desire for power. Unshakable discipline. His reputation as a hard, demanding commander earned him the loyalty of soldiers. Popular appeal. Unlike the aloof patricians, Marius spoke the language of ordinary men. Step by step, he climbed the ladder of Roman offices: quaestor, praetor, governor of Hispania. In 107 BC, he secured the consulship, already a remarkable feat for a man of his birth. Marius first distinguished himself not in Gaul, but in North Africa, during the Jugurthine War. Jugurtha, the cunning king of Numidia, had outmaneuvered Roman generals for years through bribery and ambush. Marius promised to end the war. He recruited fresh troops, restructured supply lines, and launched bold campaigns. It was under his command, and with the help of his talented quaestor, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, that Jugurtha was finally betrayed and captured. The victory gave Marius credibility. He was no longer just a novus homo. He was a proven commander, a savior of Rome in foreign war. When Arausio plunged the Republic into crisis, his name was on everyone's lips. In desperation, Rome abandoned tradition. Normally, no man could hold the consulship more than once in a decade. But after Arausio, the Republic suspended its own laws. Marius was elected consul in 104 BC, and then re-elected 5 more times consecutively, an unprecedented 6 terms. For nearly a decade, he was Rome's war leader, entrusted with the survival of the state. It was a turning point in Roman politics. The rules of the Republic bent under pressure, and once bent, they would never fully return to shape. Marius knew that Rome's old military system had failed. Arausio had proven that the property-based levy, recruiting only men who owned land, was no longer sustainable. The citizen farmers were gone, their lands consumed by estates, their livelihoods destroyed by endless campaigns. So Marius broke with centuries of tradition, opening the legions to the capit censi, the head count, the poorest class of Roman citizens, men with no property at all. Professionalizing the army, soldiers were no longer temporary citizen militias. They became full-time, long-term professionals, serving for 16-20 years. Standardizing equipment, instead of bringing their own gear, soldiers were now armed and armored by the state. Each man carried the pilum, gladius, scutum, and pack, giving rise to the nickname Marius's mules. Reorganizing into cohorts, replacing the old manipular system with the more flexible, stronger cohort formation, better suited for large-scale battles. The results were dramatic. For the first time, Rome had a standing army, loyal, disciplined, and highly effective. But reforms came with consequences. Soldiers now fought not for their farms, for they had none but for pay, plunder, and the promise of land upon retirement. Who granted that land? Not the Senate, it was the general. Marius had bound his soldiers not to the Republic, but to himself. At the time, this seemed salvation. In the long run, it planted the seeds of civil war. The Marian system would produce the legions of Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar armies loyal to their commanders, not to Rome. For the ordinary Roman citizen in 104 BC, none of this mattered. What mattered was survival. The Cimbri and Teutones still roamed free. The Rhine frontier trembled. Arausio's wounds still bled in memory. And here was Marius, the man who had already crushed Jugurtha, the commander who demanded discipline and brought victory. He was not a patrician, but perhaps that was the point. The old nobility had failed. Marius would not. He became a symbol of hope, the embodiment of Rome's will to endure. In him, the Republic saw not just a general, but a savior. In the immediate aftermath of Arausio, Rome was shaken to its core, but Romans, as they always did, turned disaster into determination. The Republic rallied behind Marius, granting him repeated consulships and supreme command, and he delivered. In 102 BC at Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence, Marius crushed the Teutones. Ancient sources say 100,000 were slain or captured. Roman women, hearing of the victory, rushed to the temples to thank the gods. In 101 BC at Vercellae, Marius and his co-consul Catulus annihilated the Cimbri. On the plains of northern Italy, the tribes were surrounded and destroyed. Boiorix himself fell in battle, along with tens of thousands of his warriors. Rome had avenged Arausio. The nightmare of extinction had passed, but the republic that emerged was not the same as the one that had bled out on the banks of the Rhone. Marius's reforms created the most formidable military machine of the ancient world. His soldiers were no longer farmers with temporary duty. They were professionals, hardened by years of campaign, equipped and trained by the state. They marched with standardized packs, carried their own gear, and could build camps, roads, and siege works with astonishing speed. They became the model of Roman military efficiency, the iron backbone of an empire yet to come. But the price was loyalty. These men fought not for the Senate, not for abstract notions of the Republic, but for their general. Marius promised them land and reward. They gave him devotion in return. It was a subtle change, but it rewrote Roman history. From now on, armies would be tied to individuals. And when those individuals turned against each other, Rome itself would tremble. The names that would define the next century, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, all marched in the footsteps of Marius. Sulla would take his legions into Rome itself, unleashing civil war for the first time. Pompey, the Great, would wield military fame to dominate politics. Julius Caesar would cross the Rubicon, ending the Republic once and for all. All of this began at Arausio, not in the clash of swords, but in the failure of two generals to put aside pride. Their arrogance forced Rome to embrace a new kind of army, one that could save the state in the short term but doomed its institutions in the long run. Arausio taught Rome a lesson too bitter to ignore. When personal ambition outweighs unity, even the greatest empire can fall. The Senate's insistence on tradition, its refusal to bridge class divides, and its indulgence of aristocratic pride nearly destroyed the Republic. Had the Cimbri marched into Italy after Arausio, the story of Rome might have ended there. Instead, chance intervened. The tribes turned away, and Rome bought time just enough to reform, to recover, to survive. But survival came at a cost. The Republic itself began to erode. Arausio was not just a battlefield defeat. It was the beginning of political decay that no military victory could reverse, even centuries later. Roman historians wrote of Arausio with horror. Livy called it worse than Cannae. Orosius preserved the staggering numbers of dead. Others wrote of the Rhone running red with blood, of entire legions erased from existence. But what haunted Rome was not just the slaughter, it was the realization that Rome had killed Rome. The Cimbri had been strong, yes, but they had not outmaneuvered Roman strategy, nor invented new weapons, nor matched Roman discipline. They had simply taken advantage of division. The real enemy was pride, arrogance, and political rot. Arausio stands as one of history's great warnings. It shows that the mightiest army is nothing without unity. It shows that pride can undo centuries of conquest in a single day. And it shows that sometimes survival requires change, so radical it reshapes a civilization forever. From the ashes of Arausio rose Marius, the man who forged the professional Roman army. That army would conquer Gaul, crush Mithridates, and carve the empire of Caesar and Augustus. But it would also tear the Republic apart in civil wars that consumed generations. Arausio was thus both an ending and a beginning, the grave of two armies, and the cradle of an empire. On the 6th of October, 105 BC, Rome lost more men in a single day than in almost any battle before or after. Mothers wept, fathers cursed, the Senate faltered. And yet, Rome endured. But in enduring, Rome changed. Arausio was the moment when the Republic looked into its own soul and saw weakness staring back. From that weakness came reform, from reform came power, and from power came tyranny. When Julius Caesar marched across the Rubicon, when Augustus crowned himself princeps, when the Republic gave way to empire, it all traced back to a riverbank in Gaul, to the day Rome drowned in its own pride. The Battle of Arausio is more than history. It is a parable, a warning that even the greatest states fall when leaders place ego above duty, when unity crumbles into rivalry, when tradition blinds a nation to change. Rome survived Arausio, but it was never the same again.